A young boy goes into the woods with his uncle on a quiet Sunday morning and never comes back. All that's found is the uncle's blood-stained wallet near the tree line. For 2 years, the forest offers no answers, but when strange dreams, a burned photograph, and a child's voice calling from the trees begin to surface, a mother realizes her son may not be lost, just trapped where time doesn't move. The sun had barely risen above the dense Virginia pines when 9-year-old Caleb and his Uncle Richard parked at the forest's edge, the gravel crunching under the weight of Richard's aging Ford Bronco. It was one of those clear, crisp October mornings that smelled faintly of decaying leaves and campfire ash, the kind of day that practically begged for a walk through the woods. Richard, a man in his late 40s with a thick beard and the gentle voice of a once happy man, had promised Caleb's mother he'd take the boy hiking, just the two of them, like they used to do before everything fell apart. Caleb had begged for it. Just us and the trees, like before, he'd said, wide-eyed, clutching the old compass Richard once gave him. They locked the car, Reachers slanging a faded green backpack over one shoulder, packed with water, trail mix, and a first aid kit. Caleb skipped a little ahead, his orange hoodie bobbing between the towering tree trunks, his sneakers crunching against the underbrush. Richard called out, "Don't go too far ahead, buddy," with a chuckle, adjusting his cap as he followed. They vanished into the woods under a cathedral of golden leaves. By noon, the wind shifted. A hiker passing through the same trail stumbled upon a torn piece of fabric near the forest's boundary, bright orange, just like the hoodie Caleb had worn. A few feet away, lying partially concealed beneath a thorn bush, was a brown leather wallet, the initials R etched in faded gold along the edge of the wallet's fold. When the authorities arrived, they marked the site and began scouring the perimeter. Drones buzzed overhead. Tracking dogs barked anxiously as they picked up a child's scent, following it into the heart of the forest. Dotted in the soft soil were distinct impressions, small footprints, probably Caleb's, moving deeper into the woods. But there were no returning prints, no signs of a struggle, no broken branches, no screams reported. Richard and Caleb had simply ceased to exist beyond that point, like something had swallowed them whole. Back at home, Caleb's mother, Teresa, stood frozen at the threshold when the deputy came to deliver the news. Her knees buckled when she heard the phrase, "We found blood." The weight of the words hung in the living room like a fog she couldn't shake. Her hands trembled as she clutched a framed photo of the last birthday Caleb had with them, candles, cake, and Richard lifting him into the air with that same soft, how could that man, her brother, her son's hero, just disappear? The town buzzed with whispers. Some blamed Richard's fragile mental state since the death of his wife and daughter. Others speculated foul play or wild animals, but those closest to Richard knew he was deeply protective of Caleb. He wouldn't hurt that boy. He just wouldn't. Search parties formed and disbanded. Helicopters circled. Local news camped out near the forest entrance. But after 72 hours, the official tone shifted from rescue to recovery. Teresa refused to accept that. She posted flyers, called forest rangers herself, interviewed volunteers, even hiked parts of the trail alone. At night, she lay awake, imagining her son's voice calling her from the tree line. Days passed, then weeks. Then the woods grew silent again. Only the whisper of wind through leaves and the creak of aging trunks remained, as if nature itself had swallowed a secret it refused to give back. The wallet, the bloody edge, and those fading footprints became the only pieces of a puzzle no one could solve. The case slowly went cold, but something about that morning, the stillness of the air, the strange quiet, the way Caleb had looked back once before disappearing into the trees, lingered in Teresa's mind like a thorn she couldn't pull out. She knew something was wrong, not just missing, but wrong. The forest never gave up its secrets, not yet. In the days that followed the initial search, Teresa found herself sitting under harsh fluorescent lights in a small interview room at the county sheriff's department. The walls were sterile, the air cold. Across from her sat Detective Wallace, a man in his 50s with deep lines across his forehead and a voice too calm for someone delivering so little hope. Teresa clenched her jaw, already sensing where this was headed. She had heard the murmurs from extended family, the cautious tone in her sister's voice when Richard's name came up at Thanksgiving. Still, she never thought it would come to this. "He wasn't dangerous," she insisted, her voice edged with fatigue and frustration. "He loved Caleb. He would never—" Wallace raised a hand, gently. "We're not accusing him of harming Caleb, but we have to consider every angle. His wife and daughter's deaths, that kind of loss leaves scars. You told us he never fully recovered." Teresa stared at the tabletop, her reflection slightly distorted in the polished surface. Richard had changed after the accident, that much was true. His eyes didn't light up the same way. His laugh came less often, and there were days when he disappeared into the woods near his cabin for hours without telling anyone. Still, he was her brother. He adored Caleb. The two were inseparable. "He saw things," Teresa finally whispered, hating herself for remembering. Sometimes, at night, he'd sit on the porch and talk to them. To his wife and daughter, like they were still alive. Detective Wallace scribbled something down, his pen scratching faintly against the notepad. "Did he ever mention taking Caleb into the forest before?" "Yes," she replied, "but he always came back. Always." She stopped, her throat tight. This time was different. Outside the sheriff's department, a local reporter from WBRL News was interviewing a hiker who claimed he saw something strange days before the boy went missing. "I don't usually do interviews," the man said, his flannel shirt wrinkled and boots still caked in mud. "But people need to know what I saw. It wasn't normal." The footage later aired during the 6 p.m. broadcast. The hiker stood in front of a blurred background of pine trees, his voice steady but uneasy. "I was hiking the South Ridge Trail, maybe 3 days before the kid disappeared. I heard shouting. I thought it was a bear scare or something, but when I looked down the hill, I saw a man, late 40s, beard, camo jacket, just standing there, screaming at the trees." "What was he saying?" the reporter asked. The man hesitated. It was like he was arguing, but only one voice. He'd shout, then pause, like listening, then yell again. "At first, I thought maybe he was on the phone or Bluetooth, but there was no signal in that area. He looked terrified, like he was seeing something I couldn't." The footage went viral locally, stirring the town into a flurry of speculation. Was Richard hallucinating? Had grief finally broken him? The theory gained traction fast. People whispered about psychotic breaks and forest delusions. Some even spun darker stories, folk legends about the whispering-hearted could hear. Teresa tried to shut it all out, but the damage was done. Public opinion shifted from sympathy to suspicion. Even friends began avoiding eye contact at the grocery store. Strangers left notes on her windshield suggesting she look closer at who her brother really was. The authorities doubled down on psychological theories. A psychologist was brought in to analyze Richard's past behavior. Medical records showed a history of PTSD and mild psychotic episodes after the crash that killed his family. No medication had been prescribed, but notes from a therapist hinted at unresolved trauma, survivor's guilt, and episodes of dissociation. The one entry read, "Patient reports hearing his daughter's laughter in the woods behind his house. Claims she calls to him at night. Believes he is being watched when he sleeps." Teresa never knew any of that. She felt betrayed, not by Richard, but by the silence. Why hadn't he told her how bad it had gotten? Meanwhile, search efforts dwindled. The rangers mapped out every possible route from the location where the wallet was found. Drones with infrared scanned the canopy. Dogs returned with confused scent trails that led to nowhere or looped back. It was as if the forest had swallowed them and rearranged itself. Volunteers grew weary. The press stopped showing up. The missing flyers faded on community boards, peeled by wind and rain. Even Caleb's school replaced his nameplate with a blank. But Teresa didn't stop. She started her own line of inquiry. She visited the ranger who had logged the last reported sighting of Richard, asking questions they didn't want to answer. She tracked down the therapist who had treated him. She even went to Richard's old cabin, now vacant, and searched through his journals. What she found there was unsettling. Page after page of half-horrendous ramblings, drawings of a tree with eyes, notes written in red pen. "Caleb is the key. He sees her too. Don't trust the trail that turns in silence." The handwriting was Richard's, but the meaning was fragmented, erratic. Some pages had been ripped out violently, leaving jagged scars along the spine of Teehee notebook. At the end of one entry, just above a jagged line, were the words, If you find this, follow the red moss. Teresa stared at those words for hours, trying to make sense of them. She remembered Richard once telling Caleb, "You can always find true north if you listen to the ground." It sounded like nonsense then. Now it haunted her. She went back to the woods, armed with nothing but a flashlight, Caleb's compass, and her brother's torn journal. She retraced the route the dogs had followed. Leaves crackled beneath her boots and whispered through the canopy. The forest felt deeper than before, like it had grown thicker around the mystery, unwilling to let go. That night, just before the forest gave way to darkness, she saw it. A streak of red moss running along the base of a dead tree, glowing faintly in the moonlight, like a trail painted by ghostly hand. The weeks stretched into months, and though the leaves that had once turned golden now lay in matted heaps beneath skeletal branches, Teresa's world remained frozen in a single moment. The last time she had hugged her son, but never soaking in, since the night she found Richard's journal and saw the red moss near the tree line, something inside her had shifted, like a door cracked open in the back of her mind. At first, she dismissed the dreams as stress-induced nightmares, normal for any grieving mother. But when they started repeating with chilling precision, she began keeping a notebook beside her bed. Every night, around 2:47 IEM, Teresa would jolt awake, her sheets damp with sweat, her breath ragged, and her heart pounding like a drum. The dream was always the same. Caleb stood perfectly still beneath a massive tree, with a trunk so wide it would take 5 adults to wrap around it. His face was pale, almost waxen, and his arms hung loosely at his sides. Thick ropes bound his wrists, tethering him to the base of the tree like an offering. He didn't cry, he didn't scream. He simply looked at her with those wide, haunting eyes, as if pleading silently. "Find me." The surroundings in the dream never changed. The sky was always overcast with a sickly green hue, the air heavy with the scent of wet moss and smoke. Behind Caleb, in the shadows of the bark, stood a figure. Teresa could never see its face, only the shape, a tall, narrow silhouette with antler-like branches sprouting from its head and long arms that moved too slowly to be human. She told no one about these dreams at first, not her therapist, not the search volunteers who still sent her monthly updates, not even her pastor, who had become the only person left in town who still looked her in the eyes without pity. But the dreams intensified. Some nights she would wake up with scratches on her arms, faint but real, as if she had clawed at something in her sleep, though her windows had remained locked. Teresa began to suspect the dreams were more than dreams. She reread Richard's journal nightly, poring over every unhinged word, hoping to find a pattern, a clue, anything that might make sense of her visions. The phrase, "she speaks through the leaves," returned to her with increasing frequency, looping in her mind like a chant. 3 months passed. Snow had come and gone. One morning, a hiker named June Carter, an off-duty wildlife biologist, was tracking an injured elk deep within the Pine Hollow region when she stumbled upon something strange. Just above her, tangled impossibly high in the gnarled branches of a dead white pine, a child's baseball cap dangled like a forgotten relic. June later reported that she only noticed it because the bright yellow fabric stood out sharply against the gray sky, fluttering in the breeze like a flag. It was perched more than 30 feet above the ground, too high for any animal or human child to have thrown it. There were no signs of a storm or wind that could have lifted it there, no ladder tracks, no snapped branches. It just was. When she retrieved it, using her telescopic pole, June was overcome with a strange sense of dread. The cap had a patch stitched on the side, "Adventure Club 2021, a limited series Teresa had ordered online the previous year for Caleb's birthday. His initials, CR, were faintly written on the inside rim in Sharpie. News of the discovery spread fast, igniting a brief resurgence of interest in the case. Reporters knocked on Teresa's door again. Search parties gathered, dogs were brought back, but the renewed search led nowhere. The GPS location of the hat was nearly a mile from where the wallet had first been discovered, and the area had already been searched twice. Teresa stood beneath that tree for hours. The bark was slick with lichen, and the discovery before softly in the wind. She stared up at the spot where the cap had hung, imagining her son's head beneath it, imagining how it could have gotten there. Nothing made sense. That night, the dream changed. Caleb still stood under the tree, but this time his mouth moved. No sound came out, just a slow, deliberate motion of lips forming words she couldn't hear. When Teresa awoke, her heart thundered in her chest. She repeated the motions in the mirror, mimicking her son's silent speech until the syllables took shape. "Look behind." The phrase chilled her to the bone. The next morning, she returned to the tree where the cap had been found. With trembling fingers, she walked its base, brushing away old leaves and snow, her hands raw from cold. Then she saw it, barely noticeable, a symbol carved low on the trunk. It wasn't fresh. It looked weathered, maybe etched years ago, but the edges were still visible. An eye inside a triangle, and beneath it, the same red moss from Richard's notes, now dried and brown, like blood soaked into bark. Teresa stepped back. The symbol meant something, she was sure of it. That night she called a former folklore professor from the nearby university, a woman named Dr. Ellen Parker, who had once lectured on forest mythology and Appalachian cryptids. Teresa hesitated, fearing she'd sound crazy, but Dr. Parker listened carefully. "An eye in a triangle under moss?" the professor repeated. "That's old. You're talking about watching symbols. They appear in pre-colonial cave art and native warning carvings. It usually means a place of thin veils, where the boundary between real and other is fragile." Teresa gripped the phone tighter. "Other? Let's just say," Dr. Parker replied, her voice turning quiet, "you're not the first to dream of someone under a tree." That phrase haunted Teresa as she stared out her window that night, the trees outside her home cast in silhouette against the winter moonlight. Something about her son's gaze in the dream, its stillness, its pleading, convinced her that whatever happened wasn't natural, wasn't madness, wasn't even fully human. She began mapping her dreams against the forest terrain, lining up symbols in Richard's notebook with GPS coordinates from the park. She began seeing the dreams as a form of map, one that didn't follow compass directions, but emotional ones. Fear, grief, longing. If the forest truly held Caleb, it wasn't just earth and trees anymore. It was something else. A place twisted by mourning and memory, a place that listened, and as she traced her fingers along the old carvings once more, in the bitter cold, she heard it. A soft rustling behind her. Not wind. A breath. A whisper. Her name. 2 weeks after Teresa heard her name whispered in the woods, the forest yielded something else. Something not just heard or felt, but seen, tangible, burned into reality like an echo forced into form. That weekend, as winter receded and a tentative thread began to nudge through the thawing soil, a couple from Charlesville, Marcus and Elena, set out on a weekend retreat through Pine Hollow Forest. They were seasoned hikers, the kind who preferred remote spots and primitive camping, far from cell towers and traffic noise. Elena, a photography enthusiast, brought her vintage Canon to document what she hoped would be early wildflower blooms. Marcus brought an old paperback novel and a new engagement ring he planned to propose with under starlight. By Saturday afternoon, they had made camp not far from the ridge where Caleb's cap had once been found, though neither of them knew the area's grim history. The tree line there was dense, shadowy even in daylight, and the forest floor was still patchy with ice. As Marcus cleared brush for firewood, Elena wandered, with her camera, trailing a deer path that wound around a moss-draped oak, its roots bulging from the earth like bone. She stopped short when something caught the glint of light near its base. Charred edges, curled paper, something faintly chemical in scent. Kneeling, she brushed away wet leaves and found what looked like a partially burned photograph, still intact in its center. The image that stared back at her stopped her breath. 2 figures stood in front of what looked like a large tree. A bearded man with sun-darkened skin and a boy, about 9 or 10, both looking straight at the camera. The boy wore a red plaid jacket and had a fresh haircut, shorter than typically seen in the missing person photos Elena would later pull up on Google. But what unsettled her most wasn't the image itself, it was the condition of the photograph. The corners were blackened, curling from flame, yet the image at the center was crisp, unnervingly untouched, like it had been protected by something or someone. That night, after Marcus and Elena returned home and cleaned up, Elena posted the photo anonymously on a local online forum, asking if anyone recognized the pair. She included a question, "Was this taken recently?" The internet responded quickly. Within an hour, several users matched the older man in the photo to Richard Reynolds, whose image was still available from archived news reports. The boy, however, sparked immediate controversy. Some users insisted it was Caleb. Others pointed out subtle changes. His hair was noticeably different, styled shorter on the sides, like a recent cut. And he appeared older, even slightly taller. That couldn't be. The photo had to be old. But the haircut wasn't. Within 24 hours, someone forwarded the thread to a Reddit true crime community, and it went viral. Dozens of amateur sleuths began dissecting the photograph, background analysis, shadow patterns, comparisons to known tree species in the area. One user, a digital forensics hobbyist, ran the image through a tool that estimated the date based on degradation patterns and film stock. The result was stunning. It estimated the photo had been taken no more than 8 months ago. That was over a year after Caleb and Richard had vanished. When Teresa first saw the photo, she dropped her coffee mug. It shattered across the floor, ceramic shards spinning under the table. Her hands trembled as she stared at the screen. It was Caleb. She knew that look in his eyes, the way he tilted his chin, slightly objected mouthmark, the birthmark near his temple partially obscured by a new haircut. But it was him, and Richard, alive, somewhere, together. The sheriff's department was notified immediately. The couple who found the photograph were brought in and questioned. Their coordinates were logged and search teams dispatched to the area. But once again, the forest offered little cooperation. Nothing unusual was found beneath the gnarled tree where Elena discovered the photo. No signs of a recent camp, no footprints, no ashes or clothing or traces of human activity. The area was damp, the soil soft enough to hold impressions for days, yet there was nothing. Like before, it was as though the forest had swallowed up the scene and smoothed over its secrets. Detective Wallace met Teresa again, this time less as a skeptic and more as a man forced to believe in the impossible. "This photo," he said, sliding it across the desk. "Either it's an elaborate hoax, or it changes everything we thought we knew." Teresa didn't blink. "He's alive," she whispered. "And he's growing." Wallace hesitated. "If it's real, it means Richard's had him all this time, off the grid, no trace." "Which begs the question, why?" Teresa leaned forward. "Or maybe," she said quietly, "it means they're not alone out there, and they're not staying in one place." That night she printed the photo and placed it on her nightstand. She sat in silence for hours, studying the background, the bark on the tree behind them, the shape of the hollow near its base, the angle of the roots. Something about it tugged at her memory, not a specific place, but a feeling. She remembered the dream, the ropes, the tree, the figure in the shadows. Was this the same tree? She dreamed again that night, but this time it was different. Caleb still stood beneath the great tree, but now he turned his head slowly, deliberately, and pointed toward the sky. Teresa followed his gaze upward and saw the burned edges of a photograph drifting through the canopy, catching light as it fell. Just before she woke, the boy mouthed a single word, barely visible but unmistakable. "Closer." 3 weeks after the photograph surfaced and reignited interest in Caleb's case, a separate discovery, unrelated on the surface, began making its way through internal emails among researchers at the Mid-Atlantic Wildlife Conservancy. The Conservancy had installed dozens of motion-stringed wildlife cameras across several protected habitats, including a section of Pine Hollow that had been designated a limited accession of biodiversity zone. These cameras were primarily used to monitor the migration patterns of black bears, foxes, and the increasingly elusive eastern lynx. The footage, mostly mundane, was sifted through by interns and grad students logging animal behavior data for seasonal reports. But one of those interns, a second-year biology student named Danica Myers, flagged a clip that didn't fit any known animal profile. It was early morning when she clicked open the file labeled Cam 19 Bee Ridge Sector. The frame was static at first, a wide-angled view of a narrow rock corridor lined with lichens and overhanging ferns. At exactly 3:08 a.m., the motion detector had triggered. In the frame, a figure appeared from the left, a gaunt man with wild, unkempt hair and a tangled beard that fell across his chest. His clothes were patchy, layers of wool and canvas soaked from rain or stream water. He crouched near the edge of the rock wall, eyes darting back and forth, then stopped. For nearly 10 seconds he stood absolutely still, his posture tense, and peered through a natural crack in the stone. Danica adjusted the brightness and contrast, trying to make out what he was watching. In the next few frames, a smaller figure moved past the gap beyond the rocks. A child. A boy. Just a flash of him, walking slowly, arms loose at his side, head tilted slightly downward. The boy didn't notice he was being watched. The man didn't make a sound, just followed the child's movement with a sort of pharaoh intensity that struck Danica like a cold wind. She paused the video, took several screenshots, and sent an alert to her supervisor. By noon, the footage had reached the State Wildlife Board, and by evening, someone from law enforcement was already on the line with Teresa Reynolds. Detective Wallace drove to her home that night with a copy of the file on a flash drive. Teresa watched the footage on her laptop in silence, her hand gripping the edge of the desk. When the boy moved past the crack in the rock, she gasped. The screen froze on the still image. Caleb, same red school uniform jacket, same pants, even the small stain near the pocket where he had once spilled juice, and laughed about it. But what unnerved her even more was that he hadn't aged a day. It had been nearly a year since his disappearance. He should have been taller, more filled out, changed in subtle ways, but he looked identical to the photo on the missing posters, frozen in time. Wallace rubbed the back of his neck. We ran image analysis. Multiple matches confirm it's him, but we're baffled by the consistency. This isn't just a kid in similar clothes. It's like he never left. Teresa's eyes narrowed at the man watching Caleb. "That's not Richard," Wallace nodded slowly. "We don't think so either. Too thin. Older maybe. We're working with facial recognition software, but nothing's pinged yet. He could be off-grid, or he might not even be in the system." The footage was grainy, but when enhanced, something else emerged. The man's eyes glowed faintly in the night vision filter, not in the typical lens-reflective way, but almost unnaturally. His hands, clawed slightly, were covered in something, mud perhaps, or ash, and tattooed across the back of his notebook, triangles, eyes, spirals. The Conservancy agreed to release a portion of the footage to the public, omitting the exact coordinates to prevent vigilantes from flooding the forest. But the internet buzzed with theories. The boy's in a time bubble. The watcher is a cryptid. It's a government experiment. But to Teresa, now had moving proof. Caleb was out there, breathing, walking, somehow untouched by time or trauma. But being watched. The next day, Teresa requested access to the original camera site. Despite initial pushback, Wallace pushed it through with emergency cooperation protocols. Accompanied by 2 rangers and a wildlife tracker named Juno, they hiked 7 miles into the northern slope, where the terrain became increasingly erratic and the air carried a damp, metallic tang. Juno was the first to notice something strange. "No animal scents," she said softly, scanning the moss. "No scat, no scratch marks, like the place is dead." When they reached the rock corridor from the footage, Teresa's breath caught. The space looked untouched, ancient, almost sacred. She pressed her palm against the cold stone where the man had crouched and turned her face toward the gap. Trees moved softly in the wind beyond. Leaves shimmered silver in the light. But there was no boy, no sound, only silence, the kind that felt deliberate. Juno pointed to the base of the rock wall, where something had been disturbed. Fresh impressions, heel marks too small for an adult, but not wide enough for wild game. Teresa knelt and traced her fingers along one of the prints. Caleb, it had to be. She could feel it in her bones. That night, back at home, she watched the footage again, this time frame by frame. At one point, just after the boy passed and before the man disappeared from view, the figure whispered something, barely audible under the white noise of the camera's mic. Teresa turned the volume to max, leaned in close, and heard it. A single, breathless phrase. "Not yours." The words crawled under her skin. They weren't angry, but possessive. She replayed the sound, over and over. "Not yours." The next day she began combing through folklore texts and old regional archives, searching for any stories tied to children who vanished and returned uncherished. The search led her to obscure Appalachian myths, to tales of forest spirits who kept what they believed was owed. Then a retired ranger called her unexpectedly. His voice was low, gravelly with age. "You saw the rock path, didn't you? They told me to stay away from that place in '89. Said time didn't move right there. Said it watches." Teresa's heart pounded. "Who told you that?" There was a pause. "They didn't have names," he said. Following the unsettling footage and the whispered warning, Teresa began to delve deeper into Pine Hollow's past, not as a grieving mother, but as an investigator of the intangible. Her home transformed into a war room of open books, digitized maps, folklore manuscripts, and hastily scribbled notes. The phrase, "not yours," played on a loop in her head like a mantra layered with threat and mystery. She found herself chasing threads that logic had long since abandoned discussion. Stories, legends, oral traditions passed down in hushed tones. She began visiting old locals, particularly those whose families had lived on the forest's edges for generations, and what she learned turned folklore into possible fact. One elderly woman, Myra Jenkins, sat on a creaky porch just a few miles from the eastern ridge, her cloudy eyes narrowing at the mention of the rock corridor. "You're asking about the Stillwood," she said, tapping her cane. "That's what we used to call it before the signs went up and the state fenced it off. Time doesn't behave right there. Never has. My great-grandfather went in once looking for his missing cow. Said he heard his mother calling from the trees, and she'd been dead 7 years. Came back white as bone, wouldn't talk for weeks." Teresa leaned forward. "Did anyone ever not come back?" Myra nodded solemnly. "More than a few, but they only go in when they're grieving. That's the rule. The forests don't open for just anyone. It only takes what hurts." The old woman's voice dropped. "And once it takes, it holds." Teresa left Myra's house trembling. That idea, the forest opening for the broken-hearted, hit too close. Richard had never recovered from his loss, and she, chasing Caleb through dreams and whispers, had become just as hollow. The phrase, "the forest don't open for just anyone," echoed in her ears as she drove home. It wasn't just a place, it was a filter, drawing in those who bled from inside. Later that night, she decided to revisit the one item she hadn't dared examine in months, the leather wallet that had been found near the tree line the day Richard and Caleb vanished. It had been returned to her after the case went cold, its contents bagged and cataloged, ID, crumpled receipts, a faded photo of Richard's wife and daughter, and a torn piece of notebook paper she'd initially dismissed as a shopping list. But now, under the harsh light of her desk lamp, Teresa unfolded the slip again and saw the handwriting wasn't a list, it was a note. In Richard's looping, uneven script, it read, "I hear her calling, every night, same words, same voice. She's waiting where we last sat, beneath the old ash tree. If I don't come back, tell Teresa to look under the roots. I've left something there, something she should know." Teresa read the message 3 times before it sank in. The old ash tree, not just any tree, but the old tree, as Richard always called it. It was a place from their childhood, a spot they visited often on family hikes, an enormous ash tree with roots that curled out of the ground like frozen serpents. It had been the last place he took his wife and daughter for a picnic before the crash. Teresa had forgotten about it, but Richard hadn't, and maybe he had known, even then, that something about it wasn't right. By morning she was already packed. With a map folded into her coat pocket and a flashlight strapped to her backpack, she hiked toward the Northern Basin Trail, where the ash tree stood roughly 6 miles in from the ranger's gate. The terrain was unforgiving, steep in parts, icy in others, but Teresa moved with purpose, her breath sharp in her throat. When she finally reached the clearing, sunlight filtered through skeletal branches, casting long shadows over the base of the tree. She knelt and traced her hand along the gnarled bark, just as she had done in the dreams. Then she began to dig. It took less than an hour. Her fingers hit something hard, a metal tin, old and rusted, wedged beneath the thickest root. She pried it free and opened it slowly. Inside was a stack of papers, a flash drive sealed in plastic, and a small toy car, Caleb's, blue with one wheel missing. The papers were letters, some addressed to Tess, and others simply to her. They were dated sporadically, all written in Richard's hand, and all descending into a tone of obsession and confusion. One letter stood out. "Tess," it began, "I saw her. Not like a ghost, not like a memory. She was there, in the hollow. She didn't age, didn't speak, just watched. And she showed me the boy, not just Caleb, other boys, other children. All quiet, all still. The forest keeps them. It calls them because they're broken. I followed the voice to find closure, but what I found was her. I think I understand now. She's not evil. But what I found was her. I think I understand now. She's not Kynal, Eva. And once you're in, time stops trying to follow you. Teresa dropped the paper as her hands began to shake. Richard hadn't just disappeared. He had surrendered. He had walked into the heart of something ancient, believing he might find peace. But it hadn't offered peace. It had offered stasis. She turned the flash drive over in her hand, then pocketed it, deciding to view its contents later, when she wasn't surrounded by roots and silence. As she rose to her feet, the wind shifted, the rustling in the trees changed rhythm, almost like a pattern, like a chant. Teresa spun slowly, her breath fogging in the sudden cold. She saw nothing. But she felt watched. That night she sat in her kitchen, lights off, flash drive in her laptop. Inside were 6 video files, low quality, time-stamped. The first few were shaky, Richard walking through the woods narrating into the camera. I heard her again last night, same spot, I'm going back. Then, a shot of the ash tree. Then, darkness. The last file was different, a still image, a photo. It showed Caleb standing by the tree, one hand resting against the bark. Behind him, barely visible, a figure, tall, obscured by shadows, with what looked like limbs branching from its head like antlers, motionless. Caleb's eyes stared at the camera, blank, not scared, just. After watching the final still image from Richard's flash drive, Caleb with one hand on the ash tree and that impossible figure looming behind him, Teresa didn't sleep. She sat at her kitchen table until sunrise, the only sound in the house, the slow ticking of the wall clock, and the opening of a carelessness in impossible sightings, had taken on a presence in her mind, no longer just a setting, but a character in itself. She now believed fully what she had only feared before. Caleb was not simply lost in the woods, but held there, preserved like an insect in amber, untouched by time, and cradled in some unknowable logic that did not answer to human reason. And if the forest had chosen to show her something, through dreams, letters, images, and symbols, then perhaps it was willing to listen too. Maybe, just maybe, she could speak back. That morning, Teresa climbed up to the attic and found the old storage box labeled KLAB 36. Inside were scattered reminders of a life once filled with laughter and routine, coloring books with scribbles in the margins, plastic dinosaurs, mismatched socks, a glow-in-the-dark night light shaped like the moon. And then she saw it, the small, worn plush fox Caleb had named Rusty. Its fur was matted, the plastic nose slightly chipped, but its eyes still held that strange manufactured sparkle. She remembered it vividly. Caleb used to sleep with Rusty every night, pressing the button in its belly that triggered a cheerful voice. "I'm your forest friend. Let's go on adventures together." That voice had echoed through the home for years, until the day the batteries gave out. Teresa had never replaced them. She thought about how ridiculous it seemed to carry a dead toy into a haunted forest. And yet, her fingers closed around Rusty's small frame, and she placed it gently into her backpack. By afternoon, she was back on the ranger trail, this time alone, having told no one, not even Wallace, where she was going. She needed this journey to be unshared, unfiltered. The ash tree wasn't far, but she didn't stop there. Guided by instinct and the fragments of Richard's recordings, she veered off the marked path, deeper into the parts of Pine Hollow where moss blanketed every stone and even the birds fell silent. She moved carefully, every footstep deliberate, the forest seeming to pulse with its own rhythm around her. Rusty pressed against her back, a quiet companion in a place that defied all reason. As dusk began to fall, Teresa found a clearing surrounded by 6 tall trees, each different in bark and leaf, as though plucked from different parts of the world and planted here with intention. It felt symmetrical, unnatural in its perfection. She stopped, placed her backpack on a fallen log, and sat down. She didn't call out. She didn't cry. Instead, she reached into the bag and pulled out the toy, setting it on the moss in front of her. The air felt thick, like it was holding its breath. "I brought this for him," she said quietly, her voice barely above the wind. "It used to help him sleep. Maybe it can help me reach him." The fox sat motionless, a faded relic from a forgotten nursery. Terry waited. Minutes passed. The light dimmed further. She wrapped her coat tighter, her breath visible in the cooling air. Then, just as the last sliver of sun dipped beneath the horizon, the silence broke, not with an animal cry or the rustling of leaves, but with a mechanical chime. Ding! Bird snapped open. Rusty had moved. Not by much, but its head now tilted slightly, as if it had been nudged. Teresa stared, her heart thundering. Then, from within its hollow chest, a voice spoke. "I'm your forest friend. Let's go on adventures together." The exact phrase, but with something off, the cadence slower, almost distorted. The voice was familiar, but warped, like a recording that had been dragged through static. Teresa gasped and crawled forward, her hands trembling as she picked it up. The switch was still off. She opened the back, no batteries. The compartment was empty, the wires frayed. There was no earthly reason it should have functioned. The toy repeated its message, this time more drawn out, as if struggling through resistance. Then silence. Teresa stared into the fox's plastic eyes, tears welling up. Something had hurt her. Something had answered. She wasn't imagining it anymore, wasn't just chasing shadows and dreams. The forest had taken notice. Her son was here. And this was the first crack in the wall. She stayed in the clearing until long after nightfall, listening for anything. Footsteps, whispers, the shift of branches. The air around her felt charged, like a storm just beyond the horizon. She didn't sleep. She couldn't. Instead, she whispered to the darkness, "Caleb, baby, I'm here. I've come to bring you home." The fox remained silent, but somewhere deeper in the woods, a soft humming began. A melody she couldn't place, childlike, circular, sung in a language that felt more emotional than verbal. It grew louder, then faded again, weaving through the trees like a thread leading toward something just out of reach. It happened the morning after Teresa sat through the night in the forest, the plush fox now silent again and heavy in her hands. Unbeknownst to her, at the far southern boundary of Pine Hollow, near a little-used ranger checkpoint known as Station 3, an officer named Paul Redford was beginning his shift with routine log updates when he saw movement through the reinforced glass of the entrance. At first, he thought it was a deer, a common enough sight at that hour. But then the shape moved differently, on two legs, uneven and slow. When the figure emerged into clearer view, Paul froze. A child, barefoot, his hair tangled, his face gaunt, stumbled through the brush like he'd walked for miles. His clothes were damp, muddy, torn slightly at the sleeves, and he blinked up at the building as if seeing a structure for the first time in his life. Paul rushed outside, calling, "Hey there, are you okay?" The boy looked up, and for a split second, Paul swore the kid recognized him, before collapsing forward onto the gravel with a soft gasp. Within an hour, the child had been transported by emergency responders to the regional medical center. News traveled fast. When Teresa received the call, her breath stopped entirely. "We have a boy here," said the nurse, in a tone edged with disbelief. "He says his name is Caleb." Teresa's vision blurred. She dropped her coffee mug again and rushed to the hospital. But what struck her to the core wasn't that Caleb was alive. It was that he looked exactly the same. Not older, not taller, not thinner, not thicker. Exactly as he had been 2 years ago, down to the small birthmark near his temple, the same subtle curve of his lips, the missing shoelace he'd never replaced. The doctors were baffled. They ran blood tests, X-rays, MRIs. Everything physically about the child matched the records from 2 years prior, except for a few shocking anomalies. His bone density was diminished, not consistent with a growing child. His skin showed signs of prolonged vitamin D deficiency, like someone who'd lived underground or in extreme darkness for years. And yet there were no signs of trauma, no malnutrition severe enough to explain it, no cognitive delay. He spoke softly, lucidly, but remembered very little. Except one thing. When Teresa arrived, tears streaming down her face as she collapsed into the hospital chair, the boy stared at her for a long time. Not quite blank, but as if through a fog. He reached out slowly, touched her fingers and whispered, "Mom?" She nodded, choking on relief. Yes, sweetheart, it's me." He looked around, eyes wide but unfocused. "Where's Rusty?" Teresa's heart dropped. She pulled the toy from her bag and placed it in his lap. He clutched it instantly. Then he said the only full sentence he would speak for 2 days. Plan said, "Don't look back. Doctors tried everything to access his memories. Psychologists theorized dissociation. Law enforcement assumed trauma-induced amnesia. But none of it explained why Caleb hadn't aged." Teresa watched as the staff made excuses for every detail. His unchanged teeth, his stunted nails, the lack of weathering or scarring, but she remembered the letters, the footage, the symbols, the humming, the forest friend's voice. And now this. Her child had returned, untouched by time, but not untouched by something else. She sat by his bed through the nights, whispering stories from when he was little, watching the monitors beep steadily. He never asked for screens, for candy, for cartoons. He rarely blinked, but sometimes at night he would mutter things in his sleep, fragments. He waits behind the tree. The sound turns inside. "Don't look at the third shadow," and once, barely audible, "She knows when you remember." The hospital couldn't explain it. Caleb's heart rate was normal, no signs of infection. His brain showed minor stress, but nothing dangerous. Yet every test showed a body strained by a different kind of pressure, the pressure of existing without sunlight, without aging. Her son began to suspect that the boy they had found wasn't just Caleb. It was a version of him, trapped in some loop, some hollow of suspended time. And when he emerged, it hadn't been escape. It had been release. The phrase, "don't look back," consumed her. What would have happened if he had looked back? Who told him that was behind him? When she returned home with Caleb days later, news crews crowded the street, but Teresa gave no interviews. Wallace came to visit, visibly shaken. "We compared his current medical scans with the old ones," he said. "It's like nothing changed except the context. But there's something else." He handed her a printed photo, thermal imaging taken of the area near Station 3 the night Caleb was found. "There was a heat signature," Wallace said, pointing to a blur beside the path. "Not a deer, not a person either. Something tall, stationary, gone within seconds." Teresa stared at the red silhouette, her mind racing. She had seen a similar outline before, behind her son, behind the tree, in Richard's still frame. She stayed up that night, watching Caleb sleep. At 3:08 a.m., the exact moment the footage had been recorded weeks prior, Rusty lit up and played the same distorted message. "I'm your forest friend." The revelation came not from a dream or a whisper in the forest, but from a forgotten folder buried deep in Richard's old cloud drive, one that had been synced from a phone he left behind, never accessed because the device was locked and deemed irrelevant. After Caleb's return, Teresa had begun combing through every piece of digital residue tied to her brother, desperate to find something that would explain what had truly happened. On a rainy Tuesday afternoon, after a third cup of cold coffee and a forgotten lunch, she clicked on a folder labeled simply, "For Later." Inside were 3 audio memos, recorded in hushed tones, some with forest sounds in the background, crackling leaves, the chirr of Elsie's insects, the distant hush of wind threading through high branches. The first one began with the sound of Richard's breath, ragged and shaking. Entry 1. September 12th. If anyone finds this and I haven't come back, I need you to know this wasn't an accident. I didn't get lost. I went in on purpose. Teresa sat still, the room around her fading as she leaned into the speaker. They're releasing him. A technicality, some appeal. They said he served enough time, but he broke Caleb's arm. He left bruises no one saw, and no one believed me. They think I'm unstable. They think I snapped after the crash. Maybe I did, but I know what I saw. I know what he did to that boy, and I couldn't let him near Caleb again. I won't. Teresa's stomach clenched. She hadn't known. Richard had never told her what Caleb's father had done behind closed doors, and no one had questioned the man's absence because of the convenient narrative of divorce and distance. Claire made an adjustment. But now, the context shifted violently. Richard hadn't just vanished, he had escaped, stolen Caleb away from something he feared more than the forest. The second memo played, dated 3 days later. "We're inside now. I brought supplies. Caleb thinks this is a special adventure, told him it's our secret place. And it is. I don't know what it is exactly, but it listens. The moss marks paths that weren't there yesterday. Sometimes the sun rises twice. Sometimes the birds don't blink, but it's safe. It doesn't let people follow. Time folds here, slows down. Maybe even stopped. Eth hasn't asked for anything in return." The third memo was shorter, more fragmented. "It's harder to remember the way out. The markers are changing. My dreams are bleeding into the day. Sometimes Caleb asks when we're going home, and I don't know what to say. He's not aging. I think it's because of the place. I think I'm forgetting things. Important things." The audio cut abruptly. Teresa sat back, pulse racing. The truth unfurled like smoke. Richard had found the rift in the forest, a space immune to linear time, and he had used it to protect Caleb, from his past, from a legal system that had failed them. But in doing so, he had exposed them both to a greater danger, the danger of forgetting, of becoming unstuck in a world that did not obey the rules of memory or aging. She printed the transcriptions, highlighted the coordinates mentioned in the metadata, and took them to Wallace. He read them in silence, his jaw set. "So he ran," Wallace finally said. "Not from guilt, from desperation." Teresa nodded. He wasn't trying to disappear, he was trying to save him. Wallace exhaled slowly. "Then what stopped him from coming back?" Teresa's voice was quiet. "The forest doesn't just hold you, it unravels you." And somewhere along the way, Richard had begun to forget who he was, why he'd come, and eventually how to leave. Perhaps it was the loss of his wife and daughter that made him vulnerable. Perhaps it was the weight of carrying another broken child. But whatever the cause, he had remained in the hollow, watching, hiding, possibly even believing he was still protecting Caleb long after they both had been forgotten by time itself. The next night, Caleb awoke screaming. Teresa rushed into his room to find him curled against the wall, whispering, "Don't look back, don't look back, don't look back, don't look back," over and over. It took an hour to calm him. When he finally fell asleep again, he clutched Rusty so tightly the seams strained. Teresa stayed up, tracing every part of the transcriptions for clues. That phrase, "Don't look back," had haunted her since the day Caleb returned. Now, paired with the memos, it became clear. Richard must have told him that before the final moment. Maybe there was a path out, but it only worked if you didn't turn around, if you didn't acknowledge what followed. The being, the watcher, the one with antlers in shadow. She thought of Richard, still out there, perhaps a shell of who he once was, circling old roots, speaking to ghosts, waiting for a sign of purpose in a place where time no longer moved forward. She had recovered her son, but she had not recovered her brother, and in that realization grew a quiet resolve. She would not leave him behind. 3 nights after Caleb's terrified whisperings and the revelation from Richard's voice memos, Teresa returned to the forest with only a flashlight, Rusty tucked beneath her arm, and the faint hope that something, somewhere still listened. She didn't tell Wallace or the hospital or even leave a note. Some things, some crossings, had to be done alone. She followed the path her brother once took, marked only by instinct, fragments from his audio logs, and the deep pull in her chest that grew stronger with every step into the darkness. By midnight, the moon was high, casting a pale silver glow across the forest canopy, and the ash tree appeared ahead like a cathedral risen from earth, its bark slick with dew, its roots pulsing with the memory of all who had knelt there before. She stood before it, trembling. "Caleb," she whispered, "if you're near, if you remember me, I'm here." She stepped forward and pressed her palm against the trunk, the roughness biting gently into her skin, and then the forest changed. It wasn't a sound exactly, it was a shift, a pull, a sudden stillness that pressed against her ears. Then, like mist unraveling, a voice rose from within the wood. "Mom," soft, frightened, unmistakably Caleb. "Mom, I'm here." Teresa's breath caught. She didn't move. The bark beneath her palm began to pulse with a faint warmth. A crack appeared, thin as a paper cut, snaking upward and outward until a seam opened in the bark, revealing not wood, but shadow, a hollow lit by a cool, unnatural glow. Teresa stepped back, wide-eyed, as the gap widened. From within the darkness, the voice repeated, "Closer now. Mom, hurry." Without hesitating, she stepped inside. It was not like entering a cave or a room. It was like stepping into memory. The air shimmered, thick with suspended dust that moved like stars underwater. The ground beneath her feet was soft and springy, as if made from moss and breath. Shapes moved beyond her peripheral vision, not threatening, but watching. Then ahead, standing beneath a twisted branch that pulsed like a vein, was Caleb, just as he'd been, eyes wide, arms trembling, Rusty held tight against his chest. He ran to her, silent tears slipping down his cheeks, and when she dropped to her knees and wrapped him into her arms, something inside her soul reassembled. "I knew you'd come," he whispered. "Uncle said you would." She held him tighter. "We're going home," she said, "now." But Caleb shook his head. "He can't come. He said he's part of it now." And that was when she saw him, Richard, emerging slowly from the far side of the hollow, his beard tangled, his eyes unfocused, but a smile twitching at the corner of his mouth. "Tess," he murmured, voice cracked and distant like someone waking from a long dream. "You found him. You found him." She stood, still holding Caleb, and stepped toward her brother. "You can come too. We can leave together." Richard tilted his head, like he was listening to someone else entirely. No, I don't think I can. I stayed too long. The forest knows me now. I'm part of the rhythm. But you were always the one meant to take him home." His eyes drifted toward Caleb. "He's not broken anymore. He doesn't need hiding." Tears welled in Teresa's eyes. "Please, just try." But Richard only smiled. He reached out, touched Caleb's hair softly, and whispered, "You're safe now, buddy. Don't be afraid of the sunlight anymore." Then he turned, walked slowly back toward the heart of the hollow, and as he stepped past the furthest tree, his figure began to fade, not like vanishing, but like becoming part of the space between the trees. The bark where the door had opened pulsed once, then began to close, vines weaving over the seam like a scar healing in reverse. Teresa looked down at her son, still gripping her hand, and for the first time in years, he looked like he belonged somewhere real. They walked out of the forest as the first light of morning cracked the horizon, the mist lifting from the earth like breath held too long. And behind them, where bark had once split, there was only a tree. If this story moved you or gave you chills, don't forget to like and subscribe for more mysterious narratives like this. We'd love to know, what do you think really happened to Richard in the forest, and which moment hit you the hardest? Tell us your thoughts in the comments below. Also, where are you watching from? We're always curious to see how far these stories reach.